Ay, hello po, Doc.
Hello? Yeah?
Ay, hello po.
So,
Ano po, Doc?
the general categories of research design, dalawa lang naman, di ba?
Opo.
So, which are Q
Ano
and
po?
Q lang.
Qualitative and quantitative research
So,
po,
yun
Doc.
lang yun, di ba? Thank you. So, it's just quantitative and qualitative. So, as you could recall, no, ito na lang yung summary of differences nila. When the type of knowledge for qualitative research is for a subjective, no? But for quantitative, it's more of objective. For characteristics, no, ang qualitative research is more flexible, pero quantitative research is fixed and controlled. And then for sampling, sinong nakakaalala pag qualitative research, TF? Do you recall what we use for the type of sampling we usually use for qualitative research?
Good evening po, Doc.
Yes, good
Kapag
evening.
qualitative po, purposeful po.
Purposeful. And for quantitative?
Random
Usually,
lang po, Doc.
Random. Okay. And then for nature of data, no? So remember, qualitative research, ito yung mga SGDs, di ba? More of SGDs, focus group discussions, ganyan. The how and why of a particular phenomenon. So, ang nature of data natin dito is narratives, quotations, and descriptions as opposed to quantitative na numbers. Kaya nga siya quantitative and statistics, no? And for qualitative research, we value uniqueness and particularity. But for quantitative, we're more of parang dapat nare-replicate yung results ng research, no? And then for analysis, do you recall, Kayla, kung ano yung analysis for the qualitative research?
Hello, Doc. For qualitative po, thematic. Sa
Thematic,
quantitative
okay.
po, statistical po.
Very good. So thematic, yung mga recurrent issues lang, recurrent concerns that come up kapag nag-SGDs or during interviews. No, quantitative yan. Alam na natin to, yung mga stats natin. Okay, so that's for the general categories of research design. When we go down to the quantitative, no, quantitative research designs, pwede pa rin natin silang hatiin into two, di ba? So, do you recall, Brian? Yung two general categories for quantitative research designs. We have Brian. Duty ba si Brian? How about si Ferds? Duty din ba si Ferds? Magka-duty pa sila. Sige. Let's go back to Nathaniel. Ano nga ba yung two general categories, if you recall? We have letter P.
Call a friend po, Doc.
Sorry?
Call a friend po, Doc.
Call a friend. Okay, letter P. Aning P and S lang sila. Letter P for DM.
Doc, primary po.
Primary. Very good. And the secondary. So pag primary, ano lang to, ito yung mga actual factual first-hand accounts or the original research. Kayo talaga yung gumawa ng mismong research. For the secondary, ito lang yung pinagsama-sama, yung mga results ng primary result to come up with one general parang conclusion or outcome or result, no? So, ayun. And then, when we go down to the primary study designs na tayo, yung mga original researches, may tatlo tayong parameters kung paano natin sila pwedeng i-classify. So, they could be classified according to number 1, the objective of the study, 2 is the direction of inquiry, and the third is the manipulation of the study variable, di ba? So, for primary studies in science, if you want to divide them according to the objective of the study, pwedeng dalawa yon, two general categories. So, which are? Si Kayla.
Doc, descriptive po, saka analytical.
Very good. So, descriptive and analytical. When we say descriptive, ano yung general lang na naalala nyo regarding descriptive study design? Si Maine.
Doc, yung mga case reports po, Doc, prevalence studies and ecologic studies po, Doc.
Okay, those are the 3 specific study designs. But when we say descriptive in general study design, ano yung ginagawa niya lang usually?
Ay, yung dinidescribe lang, Doc, yung certain characteristics ng
Okay,
problem.
very good. Okay. And when we say analytical, Christine?
Hello po, Doc.
Aha.
Analytical
Ay,
po, analyze
So-
po yung relationship between po yung variables, Doc.
Okay, sige. So, we analyze yung health status in relation to other variables, no? And then, for the descriptive lang, ano yung usual na outcome? Ano yung usual na use ng descriptive studies? We usually, sa descriptive studies, nakaka-formulate tayo ng hypothesis. In contrast sa analytical, ano ginagawa sa hypothesis na? Si Nathaniel.
Ay, hello po, Doc.
Aha.
Ay,
Sa
ano po?
pag-analytical study designs,
Ano po, Doc?
kung yung descriptive siya yung nag-formulate, yung analytical, yun na yung
Ayun po yung parang magko-compare po ng mga data, Doc. Parang
okay, tama naman, no? Magko-compare ng data. So, itong part ng pag-analytical study design, ito na yung magte-test ng hypothesis na usually galing sa descriptive study designs. And yun, ang main feature ng analytical study designs ay yung pagkakaroon ng comparison group. So, kung ma-recall nyo yung picture na yun yung one of the main characteristics ay yung pagkakaroon ng comparison group. Hindi lang siya isang group and then you follow them up. Dalawa talaga minimum yung group. Okay. So nasabi na to kanina, yung mga kinds ng descriptive, yung specifics studies under descriptive study designs. These are the case reports or the case series, and then the prevalence studies and the ecological studies. No? So for analytical, no, if you want to ano yun, classify them according to the manipulation of variables, ano yung dalawang categories? DM. If you want to divide or classify them according to the manipulation of variables, may dalawang klase ng analytical study designs. They are sino
Doc, yung
tinawag
ano
ko?
po, yung observe,
Tama.
yung longitudinal po ba? Or
According-
cross-sectional?
That's when you divide them according to parang direction of inquiry, although yung direction of inquiry subdivided pa siya dun sa yun nga cross-sectional, ayun, at the same one point in time, longitudinal, when you collect data, no, over an extended period of time, and then if you collect data ano yun, in the towards the future or forward in time, that's prospective. And then for kung pabaliktad naman, that's retrospective. Pero but if you want to classify analytical study designs based on the manipulation of variable, ano yung dalawang klase ng categories niya? So let's call Kyla. Kyla, do you recall? Kyla? Letter O and E. Main?
Doc, yes po, observational at saka experimental po, Doc.
Okay, observational and experimental. So what's the difference between the two, Christine?
Hello po, Doc.
Mhm.
Yung observational po, wala pong manipulation of exposure. Tapos sa experimental po, meron pong manipulation.
Okay, very good. So, yun lang yung difference nila, no? And then, for observational, we discussed, actually, hanggang pangalawa pa lang tayo, pero there are 3 specific study designs. These are, Nathaniel.
Ay, hello po, Doc.
The
Ay,
3 specific, 3 specific study designs under the observational research design. So, tatlong C lang? Tatlong C?
Opo. Case control po, Doc.
Okay.
Cross-sectional po, Doc. Tsaka po, cohort.
Okay, very good. So, we already discussed cross-sectional, no? Ano ulit yung cross-sectional? Kayla? So, in terms of, hello, Kayla?
Doc, for cross-sectional po, describes the population at certain point of time.
Minameasure niya yung exposure. Actually, since this is under the analytical study design, no? So, they analyze variables. So, usually a health status and an exposure, no? So, pag cross-sectional study, they measure the outcome or the disease of interest and the exposure or yung hypothesized na risk factor at the same point in time. So, tama siya. That's cross-sectional study. So, the measure of disease frequency for cross-sectional studies is main?
Again po, Doc?
Ano yung measure of disease frequency for cross-sectional studies?
Pasa ko, Doc. Hindi ko po ma-recall.
Sige. Okay lang. Nathaniel. Ano yung measure of disease frequency for cross-sectional studies? Ano yung na-measure natin? Prevalence or incidence?
Prevalence po, Doc.
Prevalence, very good. So, when we say prevalence, na-measure mo yung new and old cases, no? Okay. How about cohort? Ito na-discuss pa natin to. DM. Ano yung cohort?
Doc, yung ano po, it selects a group of exposed individuals, then compare po dun sa unexposed na individual.
And then? Okay, so tama naman si DM, no? When we say cohort, ano siya, longitudinal prospective observational study design. Longitudinal since we gather data for an extended period of time, di lang siya one point in time. Number two, prospective. By prospective, kasi kung marirecall nyo yung general study design of cohort, diba? We get from the population, no, we get a group na meron nung exposure of interest, no, meron nung exposure of interest. Tapos kukuha tayo from the same population ng another group with the similar characteristics talaga, except that itong group na to hindi sila exposed to the risk factor. And then you follow them up forward, kaya siya prospective. You follow them up forward in time if they will develop the outcome or the disease of interest. Okay? So, ganun yung general study design ng cohort. So, ano yung measure of disease frequency na may measure sa cohort? Kayla? Kayla? Do you recall? Kung prevalence yung sa cross-sectional study, sa cohort, hello? Sige, let's call main.
Yes po, Doc.
If yung measure of disease frequency sa cross-sectional prevalence, what's the measure of disease frequency for cohort studies? Ano yung measure natin?
Incidence proportion, Doc.
Okay, so
Incidence
incidence. So dalawang klase yung incidence. There could be incidence proportion and incidence rate, no? So tama. And then sorry I forgot, but for cross-sectional studies, the measure of association is the prevalence ratio. How about for cohort? Ano yung measure of association? Si Christine. Wala tawag ko pa si Christine.
Doc, relative risk po, Doc.
Relative risk. Okay.
Apo.
So, how do you interpret ulit relative risk? But pag equal to 1, pag equal to 1,
No effect po, Doc.
Okay. Pag less than 1?
Protective po, Doc.
Okay. Pag greater than 1?
Risk factor po.
Okay, very good. And then just dun sa cohort na may prospective, we have two kinds of cohort, may prospective sa retrospective, pero the difference is yung pag retrospective, the exposure and the outcome of interest already happened in the past. Pero yun pa ring basic na research design ay magsisimula pa rin from the exposure. No? And then for the prospective cohort, the exposure may have happened in the past, pero yung outcome ay hindi pa nangyayari. So you still have to follow them up forward in time. So that's the only difference between the prospective and the retrospective cohort. So we'll now go on dun sa kung saan ako nag-stop. So I'll just stop share this slide. So may tanong ba so far dun sa na-discuss? Okay, I'm not sure, pero I think dito ako nag-stop, yung parang sa exercise, tama ba? Parang na-discuss pa kasi yung... Ito, na-discuss pa to, di ba? Tama ba? Ay, nakikita ba siya? Nakikita ba yung slide ko? O
Doc,
hindi?
hindi pa po.
Sorry. Yan. Dito tayo natapos, di ba? The interpretation of RR. Tama ba, guys?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay. So, as a, exercise. Ay, tapos na to. So, may exercise lang tayo. So, sa mga first years na lang. So, meron ba kayong kahit, may phone naman siguro. So, and paper and pen kung meron. So, remember, this is just a exercise and this is just a hypothetical study, ha? So, a hypothetical study on the energy drink consumption among adults. So, halimbawa, the aim of this study is to determine the association or relationship of energy drink consumption with cardiovascular mortality among adults. So, the participants were categorized as follows: never drinker, ex-drinker, drinks less than 500 ml of energy drink. Energy drink pala to. And drinks more than 500 ml energy drink per week. Sorry, I think may mali dun sa categories. Vodka kasi nakalagay. Sorry, wait. Ayan. So anyway, let's just say na association between vodka drinking, no, versus cardiovascular mortality, no. So kung ito yung data na nakuha, no, could you compute for the relative risk for each category? So ito na lang yung table. Ayan. So for we'll compute, no, for the incidence and relative risk for the incidence para sa 4 na categories, the relative risk for the 3 other yung pababa na categories. So could you, sige, punta muna tayo sa incidence. For the never drinker, Nathaniel, ano yung incidence ng cardiovascular death? Hello, Nathaniel?
Ay,
Paano
hello
siya
po, Doc.
nako-compute lang?
Ano po, Doc? Yung pong number of, Doc, deaths po divided by po, the total po, Doc.
Okay, so that is, could you compute?
Around 6% po, Doc. Ay, 0.06 po, Doc.
So in percent?
Po, 6% po, Doc.
Okay,
6.1.
so DM, how about the incidence for the ex-drinker?
Doc, divide po yung number of deaths sa total din.
O nga, so what's, ano siya? May calculator.
0.09, Doc.
In percent?
9 po, Doc.
Okay. For those who drink less than 500 ml of vodka, si Kayla?
Doc, 29.06.
Ay, siya, sorry. Na-compute na pala dun. Sorry So for the ex-drinker, kung i-compare natin siya dun sa never drinker, the relative risk is equal to 1.489. Paano nakuha to? Main? Paano nakuha tong 1.489?
Yung incidence lang, Doc, among exposed over incidence sa unexposed.
So that will be
i-divide lang siya, Doc, dun sa
so that will be 9 point. Paano siya na-compute na 1.489? Paano ba? Sino ba yung tinawag ko? Christine?
Hello po, Doc.
Paano na-compute yung RR of 1.489 dito for those na ex-drinker?
Sorry po, Doc.
How do we compute ba for relative risk? For cohort
Bali,
studies?
incidence among exposed po,
Opo.
divided by sa unexposed po. Doc.
Okay, so ano yung exposed dito? Which one is the exposed group?
Yung number of deaths, yung total po, Doc, sorry.
When we say the exposed group, yung na-expose dun sa variable, hypothesized risk factor, which is in this case yung vodka drinking, no? So, kung ang kino-compute natin is the relative risk for the ex-drinker, sila yung na-expose di ba? Expose sila.
Doc.
Ito yung hindi na-expose, bale. No? So, ang ko-compute lang para ma-determine natin yung relative risk for those na ex-drinker, we just divide the incidence of yung mga namatay na ex-drinker over those na namatay din of cardiovascular mortality dun sa mga hindi na-expose, which is 6.129. Tama ba itong relative risk na to? Or mali ba yung computation ko?
Yes po, Doc. Pag dinivide po, Doc, yung 9.126 sa 6.129, 1.489.
Okay, sige. So we'll move on. So how about naman incidents no cardiovascular death for those who consume 500 ml of vodka per week? Si Nathaniel. Ano yung incidence nito? Simply
Ano po, Doc? 152 po, Doc. Yung number of deaths po divided by the total number of deaths po, Doc.
Which is
Okay.
Tama ba to?
150.
Tama ba, guys? In percent?
Yes po, Doc.
yes.
Okay. So how about, ano naman yung relative risk, no, of those who drinks less than 500 ml of vodka? So you compare pa rin, di ba? Those yung exposed over dun sa unexposed. So incidence nito over yung incidence lang nung hindi na-exposed, which are the never drinker. So that the relative risk will be CDM
4.74 po, Doc.
Okay, very good. Okay. So paano naman yung sa incidence of those who drinks 500 ml more than 500 ml. So anong incidence nito si Kyla? It's just
Doc,
Kayla?
59.61 po.
59.61. So what's the relative risk? Main?
Doc, ano po, 9.73.
Okay, very good. So
72.
ano yung interpretation natin sa ganitong relative risk? Sige. So how do we...
Ano po, Doc, exposure variable is a risk factor.
Very good. So remember, di ba, RR of 1, walang effect, R of greater than 1, risk factor, R less than 1, protective factor. So kung ang relative risk mo for those who drinks more than 500 ml of vodka per week is 9.727, then talagang risk factor siya since it's greater than 1. And then, so, ito yung statement, consumption of, sorry, baliktad yung aking ano ha, pero vodka na lang ilagay natin. Ano ba yan? Sorry, nagpalita kasi ako ng drink. So anyway, consumption of vodka, no, is a risk factor for cardiovascular mortality. Palitan ko na lang to before ko i-send kay sir yung PowerPoint. And then for adults who consume more than 500 ml of vodka per week, the risk of cardiovascular death was 9.73, no? Times higher than adults who did not consume energy drinks. Okay, so malinaw ba yung pag-compute ng incidence and then pag-compute ng relative risk for the first year residents? And then the interpretation, may tanong ba? Hello?
Wala po doon.
Sige. Okay, so we discussed na the cross-sectional studies and the cohort studies. We'll go now to the case control studies. So actually, dati may very, very old name ang case control studies. Ang tawag nila is TROHOC because it's just parang kabaligtaran ng cohort studies. So case control studies provide a relatively simple way to investigate causes of disease, especially yung mga rare diseases. And it includes people with the disease. So nagsisimula siya actually sa disease status in contrast to the cohort which nagsisimula ka dun sa exposure status. So case control studies include people with the disease or the other outcome variable or of interest and a suitable control. So comparison or reference group of people unaffected by the disease or outcome variable. So from the population, no, kukuha ka ng disease of interest and then hahanap ka ng group with the same characteristics except that wala sila ng disease na yon. And then you compare them if in the past, so pwede mo silang tanungin or pwede mong i-review yung kanilang records if they had the exposure of interest in the past. No? So the study compares the occurrence of the possible cause or exposure in cases and in controls. So in other words, case control studies are longitudinal, retrospective, observational research design. So pareho sila ng cohort except that it is retrospective, no? Backward in time. So para mas malinaw, ito yung general design niya, no, ng case control. So we always starts with the cases. Or yung yun nga, hanap ka ng mga tao from the population na mayroon ng disease of interest mo and then hanap ka ng same ng isa pang group with the same characteristics as the cases except that hindi sila, wala sila ng disease na yun, and then you review records or you ask them if they were exposed to the risk factor in the past. So the direction of inquiry is retrospective. Okay, so malinaw ba? Yung difference nila, yung cohort and case control. Okay naman? Malinaw pa? Sige. So example ng, the classic example ng case control studies is was the yung study na naka-discover ng relationship between thalidomide and limb defects in babies born in the Federal Republic of Germany, no? So paano siya ginawa? 1961 pa to. They compare affected children with normal children. So nagsimula sila with the disease of interest, which is yung pagkakaroon ng malformation. So of the 46 mothers whose babies had malformations, 41, no? So 41 out of 46 had been given thalidomide between the 4th and 9 weeks of pregnancy, whereas none of the 300 control mothers, so manap sila ng control with the same characteristic as those nung mga mothers na to, but itong mga to wala nung yung children nila were normal. Ayun. So they found out that of the 300 control mothers, children were normal, hindi sila nabigyan nung thalidomide. So in this case, accurate timing of the drug intake was crucial for determining relevant exposure. Very yung kanilang timing, 4th and 9th weeks of pregnancy. So before magkaroon ng disease or before mapanganak actually yung bata. So this is a case example of a case control study. So anong advantages ng case control? Less resource intensive than cohort kasi hindi siya nagre-require ng long follow-up. Walang attrition since yun nga, hindi ka magpa-follow up i-group mo na sila kung sino yung may disease, sino yung walang disease. And the disadvantage is that it is likely to suffer from problems with recall. Halimbawa, for that example natin, no, syempre kung ikaw yung mother na merong nagkaroon ng abnormality yung anak mo, mare-recall mo talaga lahat ng possible exposure kasi matindi yung nangyari, di ba? Pero for those mothers na yung kanilang babies are normal, baka hindi nila masyado actually maalala kung siguro yung thalidomide lang yung tinas, baka maalala nila. Pero kung for some vague mga exposures, baka magkaroon sila ng problem with recall kasi hindi mo naman masyadong i-recall yung dahilan kung wala naman kasing nangyari dun sa baby mo. So, ayun. So, malinaw ba yung case control studies? Or may question ba?
None po, Doc.
Okay. So, measure of disease occurrence in contrast to the case control and cross-sectional, ito wala. No, kasi nagsimula ka na nga kasi dun sa disease of interest mo. So, wala siyang measure of disease occurrence. Pero for measure of association, ang measure of association is odds ratio. So, ang kanyang computation is this one. So, odds ratio is equal to the odds of exposure among the cases or yun yung mga disease over the odds of exposure among the controls, which is yung mga walang disease. Pero how do you compute for odds, no? Medyo complicated kasi siya. To compute for odds, you have to divide pa. So the probability of an event happening over the probability of an event not happening. So kung we're talking about exposure odds, this is equal to the probability of having the exposure over the probability of not having the exposure. So para mas malinaw, let's have this table. So for case control studies, ito usually yung table na pwede mong makuha, no? So ito yung column na, ito yung mga merong disease, ito yung mga walang disease, and then pag tinanong mo, yon, pwede mong ilagay kung sino yung may exposure, sino yung walang exposure, no? And then when you compute, we have to compute first the odds of exposure among the cases or the odds of exposure among those with the disease. So pag ginawa mo yon, kailangan mo munang i-compute yun. So probability of those with the disease to have the exposure, no? So this is equal to 50 over 61 over yung probability of those with the disease na magkaroon ng walang exposure. So that's 11 over 61. And then ito pa lang yung odds of exposure. How about the odds of exposure among controls? So controls, this one. Ito yung mga walang disease. So you have to determine the probability of those without the disease na merong exposure. So that's 16 over 57 over yung walang exposure, which is 41 over 57. And then, ayan, it is equal to 1640 over 41. Tapos, i-divide pa natin yung dalawang to. So, odds of exposure among cases over odds of exposure among controls. And this is equal to 11.6. Pero hindi ko, ayan. So, medyo tedious kasi siya, no? Pero may short, so hindi ko naman expect na i-memorize nyo to. Pero may shortcut kasi siya. You just, i-times mo lang yung 50 over 41. 50 times 41 over 11 times 16. Yun na yung odds ratio nang hindi dumadaan sa sobrang daming computation. Tama ba siya? Kung ginawa nyo yun? 11.6 pa rin ba yung lilitaw? Sige, try mo nga, Christine.
Hello. Yes po, Doc. 11.65 po, Doc.
Okay, so ayun. Para shortcut lang. So hindi ko naman expect na alamin niyo yung long method or something like that. And ang mas importante is alam nyo is yung the interpretation of odds ratio. So halos pareho lang siya ng relative risk friend. So our odds ratio of 1, the exposure variable has no effect. Odds ratio of greater than 1, the exposure variable is a risk factor and odds ratio of less than 1, the exposure variable is a protective factor. So pareho lang din naman ng interpretation with the relative risk. Okay, so as a review for observational studies, no? For analytical study designs under observational studies, if we measure both the exposure status and the disease status at the same point in time, ang study design na ito ay cross-sectional. So how about if we start with the exposure status, no? So we compare two groups from the population. Pareho sila ng characteristics except that yung isa is exposed, yung isa is not exposed to the risk factor of interest, and then we follow them forward in time if they develop the disease, and the exposure happened in the past pero hindi pa na nangyayari yung disease or outcome of interest. This is anong klaseng study design? DM.
Prospective bonus.
Prospective cohort. Okay? Cohort. And then how about if it's the same study design, but the exposure and the disease already happened in the past? Kyla. Kyla?
Doc, duty po yata siya.
Okay. Sige. Main.
Doc, retrospective cohort.
Retrospective cohort. How about if ang ating study design starts with the cases, but mali siya. So anyway, we starts with the disease status, no? And then you ask them or you do chart review if they were exposed in the past, then it is a case control study. Okay, so those are the observational study designs. So we'll go now to the experimental. No, so sa experimental study designs, we have RCTs, field trials, and community trials. So just a review for experimental study designs, no, sasabi nila na it's like a cohort study, pero the only difference that the investigator manipulates, diba? The predictor variable, kaya nga siya experimental and observes the effect of an outcome. So kung makikita nyo, this is the general study design for experimental studies. So para siyang cohort. So di ba yung cohort population and then exposed, unexposed, and then you follow them up forward in time. Ang difference is yung exposure nakalagay dito as intervention, since yun nga we are actively manipulating a variable. So intervention siya rather than exposure, and then the control group, which is yung unexposed. And then very important, no, nandito na yung randomization. Yun nga, kasi may manipulation na of the variable of interest na nakaka-affect dun sa disease. Okay? So that's experimental study designs, and experimental study designs provide the best possible evidence of cause and effect relationship between a suspected risk factor and the outcome, since in the beginning, yun nga, wala pa sila nung disease of interest or your outcome of interest. Several issues, may several issues regarding experimental designs. Pwede yung sa cost, sa feasibility, and ethics. Cost kasi para siyang cohort nga, no, na nagpa-follow up forward in time ng mga mga participants, so medyo costly. Feasibility din, yan, depende din sa disease or outcome of interest mo. Pwede kasing short term lang, pero kung yung outcome of interest mo is medyo magtatagal yung pag-develop, ayan, medyo may question on feasibility. And ethics, since yun nga, may manipulation of variable, hindi siya usually ginagamit if you're if you're determining risk factors, kasi hindi mo pwedeng bigyan, parang may hypothesis na nga na risk factor yun, tapos i-expose mo ba yung isang participant. So, hindi siya usually ginagamit. Ginagamit yung experimental study designs usually for protective factors or for mga treatment. So, yun. Yun yung use ng experimental study designs. So, what are the types of experimental study designs? As mentioned, there are clinical trials and there are field trials. When we say clinical trials, these are epidemiologic experiments with patients as subjects, and the goal is to evaluate a potential cure, yun nga, cure, a protective factor for a disease, or to identify an agent which can prevent disease sequelae. So, pag field trials, the subjects are not defined by the presence of disease. So, in contrast to the previously discussed study design, which is a clinical trial, usually may sakit na yung mga yon like asthma, hypertension, ganyan. And then we're just parang yung ang tinetest natin na intervention is some kind of cure or something that will halt the progression of the disease or control the disease. That's the clinical trials. Pero field trials, walang sakit yung mga participants. So more of mga preventive therapies or preventive strategies yung tinetest pag field trials. So the focus is on the initial or the occurrence of disease. And since the incidence of disease is usually low among healthy individuals, field trials usually require a much larger number of subjects than clinical trials and are therefore much more expensive. So ganyan siya. Ganito yung kanyang general na study design. You have a population na healthy, walang sakit. And then we randomize them. Usually yung isa makaka-receive ng preventive intervention, yung isa no intervention, no? And then we follow them forward in time kung na-prevent nga yung disease na of interest natin, no? So ganyan yung field trials. So what are community intervention trials? Actually, they are an extension of the field trial that involves intervention on a community-wide scale. So ibig sabihin, groups of individuals or entire communities are the focus of the intervention. So example, no, parang halimbawa mass deworming of a certain age group in the community or mass vaccination, mga ganyan. Yun yung community intervention. As a community kasi yung kanilang intervention. Hindi siya by individual lang. So let's go now to our usual na alam na experimental study design, which are the randomized control trials. So very familiar tayo dito. Designed to study the effects of a particular intervention. So usually a treatment for a specific disease. So the subjects in the study population are randomly allocated to intervention and control groups, and the results are assessed by comparing outcomes. So ganito lang siya, di ba guys? So select a sample from the population, randomize. So randomization, no, dapat randomize para equal yung groups in terms of prognostic factors, no, di ba? Kaya nga tayo nag-randomize para yung baseline characteristics natin are similar for both groups, no? And then dahil similar nga sila in the beginning, kung may magkaroon man ng difference after the intervention, then yung difference na yon is attributable to the intervention alone and not some other factor. Kaya may randomization dito sa unang part. So may question ba for RCTs?
Wala po.
So for RCTs, our measure of disease frequency, di ko na ito na masyadong i-discuss since na-discuss natin to when I had a lecture on, appraisal of RCTs, no? So measure of disease frequency dito usually risk in treatment, risk in control, and then the measure of associations. Kung naalala, ano yung mga measure of associations na kino-compute natin pag dichotomous yung outcome ng RCTs? Christine?
Relative risk po, Doc.
Okay, relative risk. And then from the relative risk, we could compute for the other measures of association, the relative risk reduction or the treatment effect, absolute risk reduction, and the number needed to treat. So, hindi ko na rin ito i-discuss since na-discuss ito sa isa pang previous na lecture. Okay. So, in general, we already discussed, no, yung iba't ibang klaseng primary study designs. So, we'll go now to the secondary study designs. Very short na lang. So, when we say secondary study designs, ano ulit yon? These are just Nathaniel? Sorry ha, kasi paulit ko. Yung mga nauna lang yung nalista ko yung papangalan. Sige, let's have Cecilia. Secondary study designs. Ano nga ba yung difference with primary study designs?
Doc,
Uh-huh.
yung mga ano po, systematic review.
So, they simply, anong ginagawa ng secondary study designs? Secondary...
To interpret po yung ano, yung primary research.
Okay. So, when we say secondary studies designs, they simply parang pinagsasama-sama yung results from the primary study designs to come up with a one conclusion or one result, no? So there are two kinds, the systematic review and the meta-analysis. When we say systematic review, this summarizes the results of several studies. Yun nga yung mga primary studies that seem to answer the same clinical questions. Siyempre, dapat pareho yung kanilang clinical question para mapagsama-sama mo sila. And then, it is distinguished from traditional reviews by the use of the systematic methods to number one, identify, select, and critically appraise relevant studies, and to collect and analyze data from the included studies to minimize bias. So, ano lang ha guys, may mga traditional review pa rin. Kahit sa PubMed, may mga traditional review pa rin. Yung traditional reviews kasi, parang, halimbawa, may clinical question ako, and then magsa-search lang ako randomly ng mga article na gusto kong isali dun sa aking traditional review. Pwede mag-type lang ako ng mga keywords, and then kapag may appropriate number na ako ng articles, yun na yung gagawin kong basis to write my traditional review. In contrast, kapag ikaw ay gumagawa ng systematic review, dapat i-make sure mo muna na makukuha mo lahat ng relevant studies, no? Hindi lang yung pagsapat na meron ka na. Lahat dapat titignan mo. So, meron silang systematic way of searching, like may keywords, anong Boolean operators, anong search engines yung ginamit para to make sure na lahat ng studies relevant to the subject ay nakuha. So, wala silang na-miss. And then, after that, na-search na nila lahat ng mga studies regarding that clinical question, i-appraise pa nila yung mga yon. In contrast sa traditional review, basta basahin na lang. Pero sa systematic review, i-appraise pa nila yon for kung maganda ba yung pagkagawa for validity, ganyan. Kung pwede pa siyang isama sa systematic review. So, i-appraise kung okay yung article. So, after appraisal, no, syempre, dun sila mamimili yung mga tamang article na dapat isali sa systematic review. So, ganun ka-tedious yung systematic review. Hindi lang yung parang random na maghanap lang ako ng article sa ito na, may sapat na akong number. Gagawa na ako ng review. That's traditional review lang. Pero systematic review, medyo tedious siya. Para to make sure na lahat talaga ng studies na maganda, yung pagkakagawa, ay masasali dun sa review. May question ba for the systematic review versus the traditional review?
Na po.
Okay. In contrast, actually, hindi naman in contrast. Meta-analysis is a systematic review, ha? Always. Meta-analysis are always systematic reviews. So, meta-analysis are systematic reviews that use statistical methods to summarize the results of included study. Ito yung may gumagamit ng RevMan to generate the forest plot. So, nakinig naman kayo siguro, naka-attend naman kayo siguro dun sa recap session ni Dr. Espaillardo. Hindi pala si Dr. Espaillardo yata. Sino ba yung nag-lecture na? Pero recap session by TAFP regarding how to how to conduct systematic review and meta-analysis. Naka-attend ba yung mga first years? May naka-attend ba?
I think meron pero hindi lahat.
Okay. So yun. So ang ginagawa, meron bali parang halimbawa yung outcome is mga dichotomous outcomes. So pag sama-sama nila yung outcomes ng mga studies using a certain program which is usually RevMan, and they will come up with a general parang effect. So may forest plot na ma-generate doon. Siguro later on, nasa exam niyo naman yata. Pero yeah, ayun, yun yung meta-analysis, may forest plot siya, no? Remember that yung systematic review, pwedeng walang meta-analysis. So what are the instances na walang meta-analysis yung systematic review? Kapag halimbawa yung mga studies nakita na sobrang heterogeneous, so hindi similar yung outcomes, hindi nila mapagsasama-sama yon into one forest plot. So pag gano'n, minsan ang ginagawa sa systematic reviews, they just discuss the individual studies. May table and then they discuss kung ano yung outcome. Pero hindi na nila ma-generate yung forest plot since it's very heterogeneous yung mga outcomes or the way they measure the outcome in the different studies. So yun yung difference between systematic review and the meta-analysis. May question ba?
Wala po, Doc.
Sige, I think this is my last slide. Ayan. So, yeah. Yun na po siya. So, kung may questions
Thank you,
po.
Dr. Abby.
Opo.
May mga questions pa tayo para kay Dr. I guess wala. So, malinaw naman, no? Abby, after this, ano yung susunod nating lecture?
I think po it's the formulating the
research question. No?
Question, opo.
Okay. You think kaya natin next Monday?
Yeah, yes po. Wait lang po ha. Monday. Yes po. Pwede naman po, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you po. Thank you to the residents for participating po.
Thank you, Dra.
So I guess we'll see each other on Friday, no? So reminders lang dun sa mga application natin for S2 license. So you have 4 more days to comply with para makompleto nyo yung requirements. So number 1 dyan yung drug test. So meron naman tayo dun sa tabi ng ONA. And then yung mga forms na dapat